Now I'm going to take us through an important driver of these costs, but before we do that, I do have to get a little bit of terminology out of the way. One thing I like to point out that isn't in the textbook at this point, I like to point it out, is that there is a subfield called finance that I think of as being pretty closely related to this topic of costs. My undergraduate degree is in finance. Finance is actually a branch of economics, and I think of it being related because um, what finance does, as I remember it from college and working out a lot of problems, very often those problems, a task that you have to do is calculate what's called an RROR. I used to hear that term a lot, RROR, RROR, and that stands for required rate of return. You see, in my limeade example, my required rate of return, if I'm to endeavor into something, is what I could otherwise be getting. So if I'm not going to make what I could make doing this by selling limeade on the side of the road, I probably ought not be selling limeade on the side of the road, because if I am, then my real loss is how much of what I could be doing minus what I'm getting by doing that. So whatever I do, my opportunity costs plus, the foregone other thing plus my explicit costs, these equal my RROR, what I have to make a venture worthwhile. So I think of it as being related to finance, and I think that is why. It's a little above and beyond the text, but I'm guessing you find it as interesting as I do. Another little term I want to get out of the way is this distinction between the short run and the long run. So when you hear these terms short run, long run, what do you think of? Do you think 1 week is the short run, 1 day, 1 minute, a year? Long run, do you think, well, that must be like 10 years or something? And you're looking for some cutoff. How many days is a short run? How many days is a long run? If you're thinking about something like that, then prepare to be disappointed. There's nothing so firm as that. For our purposes, the short run is the period of time where little can change. And the long run is the period of time where everything can change. And so the reason that there is this difference generally is due to contracts. This will help you understand whether you're talking about something in the short run or the long run. It's really just due to contracts. I'm on a labor contract, so my wages aren't going to change anytime before, I think it's June or something like that. My status is unlikely to change anytime before like June or something like that. I mean, some things can change a contract, but contracts keep things pretty stable. And that's in the short run, because in the long run, contracts can be renegotiated. And I'm using myself as an example because a lot of labor is actually under contracts like this. A lot of deals are under contracts. And so when a variable changes, a lot of things aren't going to change very quickly, except in terms of having consequences because of those contracts in place. In the long run, though, those contracts can be renegotiated, so things are much more dynamic in the long run than in the short run, and that is why. Now, the heart of this is a little model that is very close to something we've seen before. What we're going to illustrate is something that's I really think is an important takeaway from any econ class. It's the law of diminishing marginal returns. It's usually how we hear of it. And I think this is important because it's just everywhere. This phenomenon is just everywhere. We have talked about it in terms of utility, the satisfaction that I get from cups of lemonade. What I'm going to show now is actually very similar. It's the same principle applied to production. And as I said at the beginning of this segment, this relationship really drives costs more than you otherwise might have ever thought about them. So here we go. Let's suppose we have two inputs, or two categories of inputs that we can put everything it takes to make stuff for a firm into. We have capital and we have labor. And so if we want to use math just to scare people, we could say that output is a function of labor, and capital. And we tend to use a K in economics for capital. I know it's not spelled that way. But that's because actually so many things start with C, and they already reserved the C for other things. So we use the K here. So what this means is this group of symbols that are really often written this way just to give people like me job security, is that output is a function of this and that. And this is labor, and this is capital. So workers and tools make stuff. That's yet another way to describe that expression. So let's say for a bit here that we're going to hold capital constant, because in the short run, that's supposed to be separated. In the short run, the factory has the assembly line there. It has the tools in place. And tools might depreciate, they might wear down and break and stuff like that, or you can go get more tools. But in the short run, what you have is what you have as far as the tools go. But let's say in the short run, it's easier to hire people or fire people, or to have people come in and work more hours, or tell people I don't have that many hours for you this week. In other words, labor is what we can vary in the short run, but not capital. That's what we're going to assume in our model. We could play this the other way too. I mean, if you're really looking for something fun to watch, we could do it both ways. We could do that too. But for now, let's go with that. So what I can do is look at the output of the firm as a function of labor. Okay. Now, how much output will there be if there's no one at work? This is an easy one. Anybody could get this. If there's no one at work at all, the output of the firm is a pretty sure thing not going to happen. So we know we're starting there. So let's say a worker comes in, and let me give this worker a name. See, I like to equate this to a business that I know well, run by a guy and his wife whom I've become friends with over the last 20-some years. The business is called the Fractured Prune. You might have seen some of the stores. That franchise really started in Ocean City, and the former owners of the franchise, their names are Tad and Colleen. That's Tad. And when I got to know Tad, he was running the 28th Street store, 28th Street in Ocean City. And he's a real outgoing guy, kind of loud, funny, jovial, real entrepreneur, real energetic, kind of abrasive, you might say. Doesn't bother me. I don't know anybody he does bother, but I could see people saying that. I'm sure he could agree. And he runs a donut shop, and for whatever reason in American culture, we eat donuts for breakfast, which is kind of funny if you think about it, but don't bother. Doesn't matter. It's what we do. And so donuts, and this used to be a Dunkin' Donuts commercial, donuts have to be made early in the morning. Okay. So this is a donut shop at Ocean City. And I'm sure most people watching this are familiar. Ocean City is the kind of place where young people struggle to wake up early in the morning. You know what I mean? More so than anywhere else, because it's a place with a lot of nightlife. Okay, so let's suppose for just a second, or maybe a few seconds, that Tad has a staff that he expected to be in at work on a morning at, I'd say, 5:30 or 6 o'clock is when they start. And maybe nobody showed up for work that morning. And that's where 0 donuts were getting made. And Tad rolled in a little later because he thought somebody else was going to come unlock the door and everybody would be there getting going on their own. And he rolled in a little later and saw, no one is here. We're behind schedule for opening the store. We have to have the donuts made before we open at, 7:30 or 8. Now, what is worker number 1 going to do? He's going to run around frantically getting everything going. He can turn on the machines and get them warming up. He can dump the ingredients in this tub thing that has a big arm on it like this that stirs the stuff. He can get things going. He'll have a cell phone on his ear and he'll be calling and waking people up and saying, "Where are you? You were supposed to be here. You're late," you know. And he can run around and get things going pretty well by himself. He can run the store completely by himself, but at peak times, there's a line outside the door, and to minimize that, he does have staff helping, but it's doable for him to do it. He just doesn't do it well. So the point is, with one worker, output goes up quite a bit from what it was with 0 workers. Okay, now the second worker might finally stroll in to lend a hand. Okay, now let's think about how this is going to play out. You see, in this production of donuts that they have there, the reason they're so delightful is because every donut is fresh. It's not like Krispy Kreme. I know about the Krispy Kreme light where you say, well, the light's on, they're fresh. That's only when the light is on. They have a fresh batch, and if you get there then, they're fresh. And if not, they're not fresh anymore. No, these are all fresh because they're made to order just like you order a sandwich or something at a deli. So here's how it works. You go in, and Tad is usually behind the counter, okay? Because he's an outgoing people kind of person, like I said. And he says, you know, what would you like? And you look up at a menu of all these donut choices, like at a fast food place or something. And you say, I want one of those, and one of those, and one of those. And he's writing that down on the top of a pizza box, basically. That's the donut box. He's writing down exactly what you want, 4 of these, 3 of those, that kind of thing. And then he passes that box off, and he gives you a card from a deck of cards. Let's say it's an ace of spades. So he'll write, he'll write this. What's a spade look like again? Okay, that's a terrible spade. Proceed as if that was a spade. He'll write ace of spades, the symbol for it. Maybe I should have gone with two of diamonds. I could have done that. He'll write the symbol for it on the box, and you have the card. That identifies that's your order. So he passes that box along. Now, that box sits at the end of the assembly line for the donuts. And on the assembly line for the donuts, there's a person working the mixer beater thing. It's this big stainless steel thing about this big around with this arm in it that goes like this. And that's mixing the batter. And that person takes it from there and puts it in this other thing that's it looks like it's aluminum. It's about this big around at the top. It's about this tall. And it's like a cylinder, and then it narrows, it comes down like this. And what that does is drops the donut rings. Okay? And then the donut rings come out, and then that person takes it and puts it on this, it looks like fence. It's a chain fence kind of looking thing that goes through a oven. It's about 3 or 4 feet wide, about this tall, and about 6 feet long. And it goes through at a very steady pace so that it's timed right, that it's going under that heat, and that's where that dough is cooking. And then it flops out the other side into a bus tray, and there's a person over there, another person in this assembly line, in this process, who has that cardboard box that says ace of spades and what you want, and there are all the sauces and the goos and the jimmies and all the yummy crunchies and all the stuff, right? So then this person looks at the box and gets the fresh donut that just fell off the conveyor belt and goes dip, derp, 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 and puts it on the box. And they do this till they have exactly your order, and then they go, ace of spades. And you're standing there, you lay your card in a basket, boom, out the door you go. So what you have there is a number of workers along the assembly line. The assembly line, all the machinery, that's the capital. It's constant. The workers can vary. When things, if he had to, Tad could run around and do all the tasks. He just wouldn't do them well. Now when a second worker comes in, you can begin to specialize. You can specialize. And really, even within the firm, you specialize where you have comparative advantage because Tad is the people person, right? He's the outgoing person. He's going to be behind the counter dealing with the customers because he's good at that. He could also work the machines and stuff like that, but he's the one that's good with the customers. So he's going to be there. Now he's going to have somebody helping with the machine and both ends of the assembly line to make the donuts. That's still not their optimal number of workers at a busy time, but it's doable. So this second person comes along and they add to the amount of output, but the marginal impact of the second person isn't as great as it was for Tad when he arrived. So output has risen, but not as much as it did the first time. And I think you're probably knowing where this is going. Since he called everyone and woke them up, he has workers continuing to come in. So then the third worker comes in, and now things can get pretty much where they should be, and output will go up some more. But now, you just are getting things right. Total output is higher, but the marginal output of the third person is not going to be like it was when you had one person. And if that's not clear, let's keep imagining more workers coming in, and I think it will get clear. When the fourth worker comes in, now you have a situation where the people are sort of just looking for something to do to help out. And so your marginal product of the fourth laborer might be 0. They don't really add to total product anymore, because everybody was there that needed to be there to make all the donuts that they need to make in a given time period. They were already at capacity because they only have the one set of machines. They're already there. More workers won't help because the machine, that belt that I mentioned, it has to move the donuts through at a certain pace. You can't speed that up or they won't be cooked. So adding workers doesn't make more donuts in a time period. You're already kind of there. Now, these are teenagers, and if he was calling and waking people up, he doesn't know who's going to, leave them voicemails. He doesn't know who's going to show up. So let's say accidentally a fifth person shows up. Now, these are teenagers who were all late, and they all know each other. So if they were all late early in the morning and they all know each other, and it's in Ocean City, there's a good chance they were out the night before as a group, very likely, right? And so maybe at this point, all they're doing is talking about the night before. Maybe they're kind of, as they say at workplaces, they say, tripping over each other. They're sneaking out back, smoking cigarettes, stuff like that. It could be that you would have a negative marginal product of labor. Could be, but we don't usually go there, just like we don't usually go to negative marginal utility. But when you have too many workers for a limited amount of capital or a fixed amount of capital, it could happen. So what we have here, these diminishing marginal returns, this is called the marginal product of labor that we're seeing here as these arrows are getting smaller. It's the slope of this line at each of these points. It's also the first derivative of this function, and we could graph that as its own function. And what we'd see is one that would go down like this and cross and eventually go negative as we added laborers. Now, this is an important driver of costs because you have to pay each of these people. Who yields the most per dollar of pay? The first person. Who yields nothing per dollar of pay? This person, because of that. So now, going forward, we're going to look at the cost per dozen donuts. Since this person costs, let's say the same, just to keep things simple, the same wages as each other person, that means the cost for this person's output is the lowest cost per unit of output because that person yields the most output when it's only that person, right? As you add another person, they increase output, but not as much as the first person, but they cost as much. When you add a third person, they increase output, but at a lesser rate than the second person did, but they still cost just as much. So the cost per unit is going up because of the diminishing marginal product of labor. So this marginal product of labor or diminishing marginal returns is such an important thing because this is going to be a driver of the costs that we would often not really think about without thinking about the fact that as we add more of an input, holding all else constant, in most situations in life, we yield an increasing and a decreasing rate amount of output. And that's all I have to say about